Harvard Divinity School.
100 Years Rudolf Steiner, December 15th and 16th, 2025.
Anthroposophy, the modern esoteric movement founded in 1913 by Rudolf Steiner, has become a significant presence in contemporary Israeli society. Two branches of the Anthroposophical Society operate in Israel, along with an anthroposophical kibbutz in the Upper Galilee. Several anthroposophical remedial homes and villages support people with special needs, and Waldorf education is highly popular, with hundreds of Waldorf kindergartens, schools, and training centers across the country. The widespread success of anthroposophy in Israel raises intriguing questions. How did the spiritual teachings of Rudolf Steiner, which are rooted in Western esoteric traditions and are based on a Christological narrative, resonate within Israeli Jewish society? How do Israeli anthroposophists engage with Steiner's negative views on Judaism and Zionism? In today's lecture, I will explore the reception history of anthroposophy in Israel and examine the efforts of Israeli anthroposophists to reconcile their Jewish and Israeli identities with their anthroposophical beliefs and practices. Before beginning my presentation, I would like to give a short account of how I became interested in the study of anthroposophy in Israel, as well as my personal connections with Israeli anthroposophy. I started my research career as a historian of Kabbalah, studying mostly medieval and early modern Kabbalah. Gradually, I also became interested in modern and contemporary forms of Kabbalah, as well as in other modern and contemporary esoteric movements. Within this framework, I studied the Jewish followers of the Theosophical Society and their interest in Kabbalah. During this research, I encountered Jews who were affiliated with offshoots of the Theosophical Society, including anthroposophy. It soon became clear to me that this topic deserves a separate study. Together with Ron Eilon, who is writing his PhD on the history of anthroposophical curative pedagogy in Israel, we are currently preparing a book on anthroposophy in Israel. This line of research brought me close to home. As my maternal grandmother, Raya Kern, was the founder of the first anthroposophical branch in Israel, and her home served as the headquarters of the Anthroposophical Circle in Jerusalem. As a child and teenager, I lived across the street from my grandmother and spent a great deal of time in her home. I cherish the memory of the quaint European atmosphere in her home, her piano and art studio. She was a piano teacher and an amateur sculptor, her well-tended rose garden, and her rhabarber compote. I also remember some of her German-speaking anthroposophical friends whom I now encounter again in my research. However, at the time, I had no interest in Steiner or anthroposophy, which I associated with the old and fading world of my grandmother's German-speaking circle. My mother, a secular socialist Zionist, who later became a psychoanalyst, did not share her mother's anthroposophical interests. She distanced herself from her parents' Yeke, that is German Jewish culture, and had very little patience for her mother's fascination with anthroposophy, often disparaging her esoteric and Christological beliefs. My family background shaped my attitude toward anthroposophy. In my mind, it has always been associated with the quaint, gemütlich, Yeke atmosphere of my grandmother's small basement apartment, yet it remained distant and alien to my own secular Israeli background. My personal connections and attitude toward anthroposophy align well with the academic stance I take toward the esoteric and alternative spiritual movements I study. In my research, I try to maintain an empathic attitude toward the people I study, while keeping at the same time a critical and analytical distance. Because of this approach, I have received over the course of my career criticism both from academic colleagues and from members of the movements I study. This is probably a sign that I am doing something right. Before turning to the history of anthroposophy in Israel, I would like to briefly examine Steiner's attitude toward Judaism and Zionism and to present some of his early Jewish followers. Steiner's views on Judaism and his racial theories, which stimulated much criticism and debates in recent decades, were studied by several scholars, including Helmut Zander, Ralph Sonnenberg, Peter Staudenmeier, and Ansgar Martins. Steiner expressed negative views on Judaism and Zionism already before he developed his esoteric teachings. He declared that Judaism outlived its time and that there is no justification for its continued existence as a religion or as a way of thinking. After he developed his spiritual science, Steiner embedded his perceptions of Judaism in the framework of his doctrines on cosmic and racial evolution. According to Steiner, the mission of the Jews, who were affiliated with Yahweh, the moon force, was to spread monotheism and pave the way for the coming of Christ. However, their connection to the moon force and their adherence to monotheism had a negative impact on their national and racial characteristics. In a lecture delivered in May 1924, Steiner said, "Because Judaism conceived only of this one God, it could make no image of the Godhead, but could only grasp the divine with the innermost forces of the soul, with the intellect. It is easy to understand that this led to an intensification of human egoism, for man becomes remote from what is around him if he sees the spiritual only in and through his own person. This has produced a certain folk egoism in the Jewish world. There is no denying that this is so." As the Jews fulfilled their historical mission of spreading monotheism and preparing the physical body of Christ, there was no longer any reason for their continued existence. The Jews would serve their own interests best if they let themselves be absorbed into the rest of mankind, be merged in the rest of mankind, so that Judaism as a race or people would come to an end. That would be in the nature of an ideal. Steiner, who rejected Zionism already prior to developing his theosophical and anthroposophical teachings, repeated in the lecture his objections to the Jewish national movement. That is why from the very outset I was apprehensive when the Jews, not knowing which way to turn, founded the Zionist movement. The attempt to set up a Jewish state denotes a decidedly reactionary drift, a retrogression that leads nowhere and runs counter to progress. It should be noted that notwithstanding his negative appreciation of Judaism, Steiner opposed anti-Semitism. He had several Jewish friends, and many Jews became his followers and joined the Anthroposophical Society. And we already heard about that in some of the lectures. I will mention only a few of them. Many others are discussed in the studies of Ansgar Martins and other scholars. Two central figures of Jewish descent active in the society, which were discussed by Henry and Aaron were Adolf Aronson, who helped publish Steiner's lectures, composed music for his mystery dramas, and headed the Stuttgart branch, and Aronson's friend and son-in-law, Karl Unger, who served on the Society's central board and was shot and killed in 1929, possibly on anti-Semitic grounds. Another prominent anthroposophist of Jewish origin that was discussed yesterday in Catherine Sorrell's lectures was the physician Karl Koenig. Koenig, born to an observant Jewish family in Vienna, converted to Christianity and became deeply involved in anthroposophical medicine and curative education. After the Anschluss, he emigrated to the United Kingdom, where he founded the first Campbell community together with fellow Jewish anthroposophists who fled Austria, and this was discussed recently at length in Dan McCannon's Campbell and the Future. Many of Steiner's Jewish followers accepted his negative stance toward Judaism and Zionism, became alienated from their Jewish roots, and in some cases converted to Christianity. Others, however, maintained their Jewish identity, were sympathetic to Zionism, and sought to reconcile their Jewishness with their anthroposophical convictions. A particularly interesting figure who attempted to bring Judaism, Christianity, and anthroposophy into dialogue was Ernst Müller, a Zionist activist and scholar of Jewish studies from Vienna, with a special interest in Kabbalah, who emigrated to London after the Anschluss. In recent years, the interest in his work has grown. Several articles were dedicated to him, and recently Guy Paz completed a PhD dissertation on Müller's integration of Christianity, esoteric Judaism, anthroposophy, and Zionism. Another Jewish admirer of Steiner was Hugo Bergman, a philosopher and Zionist from Prague. Bergman, who knew Müller and translated passages from the Zohar into German with him, participated in Steiner's lectures together with his friends Franz Kafka and Albert Einstein. He was highly impressed by Steiner's teachings and declared that he regarded him as one of the great teachers of humanity. As we shall soon see, Bergman became one of the founding figures of anthroposophy in Israel. In the slide, by the way, you can see a letter Bergman sent to Steiner. It was from his, he was on his way to Palestine at the time, staying in London for a few months, I think. And as you can see, he wrote the letter on the letterhead of the Zionist organization. And I wonder if it wasn't, on purpose choosing that paper and not a paper from the hotel or something. Okay, I would like to turn now to the beginning of anthroposophy is Israel. That's why you came here. The two founding figures of anthroposophy in Mandate Palestine were the above-mentioned Jewish philosopher Hugo Bergman and the Catholic artist Anna May Richter. Hugo Bergman immigrated to Palestine in 1920. He served as the head of the nascent National Library, was the first rector of the Hebrew University, and was a member of the Brit Shalom movement that advocated a Jewish-Arab binational political framework. Soon after his immigration to Palestine, he lectured and published an article about Steiner's social political ideas. In the following years, he continued to be interested in Steiner's teaching, practiced his meditation techniques, lectured and published articles about him. Although he never joined the Anthroposophical Society and voiced some criticism of Steiner and was critical of some of the Israeli anthroposophists, Bergman was a central figure in the anthroposophical network in Mandate Palestine and later in the State of Israel. He contributed much to the dissemination of Steiner's teachings in Israel and to the legitimation and esteem they received. The second founding figure of anthroposophy in Israel was the German Catholic artist Anna May-Richter. May-Richter and her husband, the Polish artist Tadeusz Richter, were closely associated with Steiner and worked with him in Dornach. They traveled to Palestine in 1924 to work on restoration of church artwork. Anna May-Richter remained in Jerusalem until her death in 1954. Since her arrival to Palestine, May-Richter tried to interest her Jewish acquaintances in anthroposophy, initially without much success. However, in the aftermath of the rise of Nazism and the persecution of Jews in Germany and Austria, many German-speaking Jewish anthroposophists immigrated to Palestine. Most of them came to the land of Israel because it offered a safe haven, not out of ideological commitment. While a few were sympathetic to Zionism before their arrival, many lacked a strong sense of Jewish national identity, and some were quite estranged from Judaism. They resettled in different towns and kibbutzim, and some of them established connections with Anna May-Richter and Hugo Bergman. In 1939, the first anthroposophical study group in Palestine began meeting in May-Richter's home in Jerusalem on Agron Street. In a letter to Marie Steiner von Sievers, May-Richter described the activities of the group in the early 1940s. And I'm grateful to Hans-Jürgen Bracker, who sent me photocopies of May-Richter letters and helped me much in my research. And I read from the letter. We are about 20 to 25 participants in total, but not all are constantly in Jerusalem. Many are working as laborers in the Jewish settlements, performing actual farming work. But most have a European education. Many were doctors, landowners, lawyers, or students, so that the evenings are filled with lectures, music, and unfortunately, also politics. May-Richter emphasized in her letter that much of the discussions of the group focus on China's Christology. Expressing a negative view of Judaism and Zionism and emphasizing the challenge of accommodating the Christian-oriented anthroposophy with the pre-state Jewish community, May-Richter explained why she did not seek to register her study group as an official branch. And that's the second passage. Given that Zionist politics has incorporated the Jewish confession and religion with all its established formulas into its propaganda and pursues it with extreme chauvinism, few Jews, and my collaborators are almost exclusively Jewish, would risk publicly affiliating themselves with a Christian-oriented society. So you see this tension from the beginning. During the 1948 Jewish-Arab War and its aftermath, May-Richter study group ceased its activities, although some of its members remained in contact. In 1954, a small anthroposophical study group was established in Tel Aviv, led by Benno Volkowitz, an immigrant from Germany who had participated in May-Richter's group. In 1959, Raya Keren, who immigrated from Germany in 1933, founded another study group at her home in Jerusalem. I never thought I had the opportunity of showing a picture of myself 3 months old in a conference, but here you go. Another small group met in Haifa. The meeting of the first anthroposophical groups were conducted in German, and nearly all their members were immigrants from German-speaking countries. However, the German-speaking anthroposophists were eager to introduce Steiner's teaching to the broader Israeli Hebrew-speaking public. The first Hebrew-speaking anthroposophical group began meeting in Tel Aviv in 1957, followed by another group in Jerusalem during the 1960s. At the time, Hugo Bergmann published several more articles in Hebrew about Steiner and his teachings. He also wrote an introduction to the first Hebrew translation of one of Steiner's books, How to Know Higher Words, published in 1960. The translation was prepared by Nachman Bar Shalom, a colorful figure and the first Hebrew-speaking anthroposophist. Born into an Orthodox family in Jerusalem, he worked for many years as a police detective and developed an interest in Buddhism, spiritualism, and anthroposophy. In 1963, he published a translation of Steiner's book Theosophy under the Hebrew title Guf, Nefesh, Veruach, Body, Spirit, and Soul. At the same year, that's the other picture, Benno Volkovich founded Michael Publications that continued to publish anthroposophical literature in Hebrew in the following years. By the way, the picture is from the Jerusalem Book Fair, and you see Golda Meir passing by. I don't know if she doesn't look at the booth, at the books at the time, but maybe she had a glance at it. In 1965, the first official branch of the Anthroposophical Society, the Elijah branch, was founded, led by Raya Kern. The group held its meeting at her home in Ibn Shapur Street in Jerusalem, just a few houses away from Bergmann's residence. Most of the members were German-speaking immigrants, including Eva and Michael Levy. Their Israeli-born sons, Udi Levy and Shimon Levy, as well as their grandson, Yonatan Levy, would go on to play a role in the later developments of anthroposophy in Israel, and we will hear about them later. In 1968, after considerable effort, the Elijah branch succeeded in establishing the first anthroposophical institute in Israel, a home for children with special needs, Bet Eliyahu in Be'er Sheva. In the next session of our conference, one of them, we will be able to hear more about this venture from Ron Eilon. In the late 1960s and early 1970s, a new stage in the development of Israeli anthroposophy began. The older German-speaking generation was gradually replaced by a younger generation of Israeli-born anthroposophists. Some, like Udi and Shimon Levy, were introduced to anthroposophy by their parents. Others were special education professionals who were introduced to anthroposophical curative education during their training abroad. Still others, including a particular influential group of young Israelis from kibbutz Givat Chaim Meuchad, whom I will discuss shortly, were introduced to anthroposophy through the Hebrew translations of Steiner's writings. One of the new centers of anthroposophy in Israel, which is still active today, was established in Tiv'on, a small town in the Carmel, in the late 1960s by Ilana Schnell. Schnell, who was born in Haifa in 1937, was introduced to anthroposophy during her training in the Jewish Anthroposophical Village for Children with Special Needs in Ravenswood, England. When she returned to Israel, she launched anthroposophical curative education classes and opened an anthroposophical study group at her home in Tiv'on that attracted several students from the local Oranim College of Education, which later will play a role in further developments. In 1990, her group founded the second official anthroposophical branch in Israel, Shaked. Another group of young Israelis from kibbutz Givat Chaim Meuchad became interested in anthroposophy in the late 1960s after reading the Hebrew translation of Steiner's writing, in the kibbutz library. And they say they just saw it and opened it up and found interest. Some of them had recently completed their army service, while others were still in high school at the time. The group included the cousin Tzvi Mader, the sibling Yehuda and Shulamit Tagar, and Yishayahu ben Aharon, who's the little guy with the... Yishayahu ben Aharon was the younger son of Yitzchak ben Aharon, a very prominent, I would say even a mythical figure of the Israeli labor movement, the head of the very powerful workers' union, the Histadrut, and a minister and the founder of the kibbutz. They formed a study group in the kibbutz, the young members, established contacts with the older generation of the Israeli Anthroposophists, and visited and worked in the Anthroposophical curative home Bet Eliyahu in Be'er Sheva. Several of them traveled to Europe and visited and studied in different anthroposophical and New Age communities. In 1979, some former members of the kibbutz, of Kibbutz Givat Chaim, together with Udi Levi, and with the help of Jerusalem Circle, founded Kfar Rafael, a curative village for people with special needs near Be'er Sheva. And from the conversation, I know that some of you visited the place. Kfar Rafael became one of the centers of anthroposophy in Israel. Today, according to the village website, the population of Kfar Rafael is comprised of about 130 people, including villagers, caretakers, and volunteers from Israel and abroad. In 1982, other members of the Givat Chaim group, headed by Yishayahu ben Aharon and other young Israelis, many of them from other kibbutzim, founded the most unique Israeli anthroposophical venture, an anthroposophical kibbutz, Harduf, in the Upper Galilee. This is, by the way, again, Yishayahu ben Aharon when he was younger. Journalist Neri Livne observed in an article she wrote about the kibbutz a few years after its foundation. Steiner laid down the proper way to be a farmer, a kindergarten teacher, a school teacher, a doctor, an artist, an architect, a politician, and even an economist. Only because he ran out of time did he fail to prescribe the proper way to be a kibbutznik. That innovation is the pride of Harduf's founders, who took the familiar organizational structure of the kibbutz and infused it with the contents of an esoteric doctrine. Yishayahu ben Aharon was recognized as the spiritual leader of the kibbutz and headed its informal spiritual committee. However, since 2010, the activities of Ben Aharon and the spiritual committee were strongly criticized, and following accusation of abuse of his spiritual authority and sexual misconduct, Ben Aharon left Harduf. The members of Kibbutz Harduf, which by the way, since then has been privatized, but it still retains its anthroposophical character and to a certain degree its kibbutz character, engaged in biodynamic agriculture and established the first dairy farm in Israel. They also launched the Harduf organic brand, which, despite its popularity, and it's still very popular, struggled economically and was eventually taken over by Tnuva, the largest food manufacturer in Israel. The kibbutz founded institutions for people with special need, as well as the first Waldorf school in Israel. Today, it includes about 1,100 inhabitants, and many of its members engage in various anthroposophy-based educational and therapeutic activities. The most successful anthroposophical venture in Israel is Waldorf education. The first Waldorf kindergarten was opened in 1987 in kibbutz Artuf, followed soon by the first Waldorf school. In the early 1990s, actually a bit even earlier, more Waldorf kindergartens and schools were opened. First in Tivon and Jerusalem, and later in other locations. And school as a parent, and just after I downloaded the picture, I took another look at the picture, and I saw that that was the first class. The first grade opened in 2005, and you can see, my son is the little, he's the cute boy over there. He's 26-year-old, and he's still very cute. And I promise that that's the last picture of a family member that I'm going to show you. Although if you want to see pictures of my recently born granddaughter, you can come after the lecture and I'll show you. Waldorf education is recognized and supported by the state. And today, there are more than 30 Waldorf schools in Israel and hundreds of kindergartens. Most of the Waldorf institutes cater for the Jewish secular sector. However, in recent years, some Arab-speaking Waldorf kindergarten and schools were opened, and I believe that Eyal Bloch spoke about it. I didn't attend this lecture, but at least he's involved in that, and he gave a lecture. Is he here? And as well as a Waldorf-inspired, and that's the next picture, a Waldorf-inspired Jewish Orthodox schools called Ma'ayanot Barchia. In addition to Waldorf kindergarten schools and the various villages and homes for remedial education, a wide range of anthroposophy-inspired activities have developed in Israel. Biodynamic agriculture is practiced in Harduf, Kfar Rafael, and several other farms across the country. The Israeli Association for Anthroposophical Medicine was established in 1995, although it's not, I don't think there are many anthroposophical doctors. And today, several anthroposophical doctors and clinics operate in Tivon, Harduf, Herzliya, and Tel Aviv, and other locations. In 1998, the first school for anthroposophical biography counseling was founded, followed by additional courses and programs of anthroposophical psychotherapy and art therapy. As mentioned above, Israeli anthroposophists began translating Steiner's writing in Hebrew in the early 1960s. Since the 1980s, several other publishers in kibbutz Harduf, Kfar Rafael, and Tivon have been publishing Hebrew translations of Steiner works and lectures, as well as other anthroposophical literature. Between 2000 and 2007, the first anthroposophical journal in Israel, Anthroposophical Life in Israel, was published. It was published by the journal Adam Olam, Human World, which continues to be published today and is a very important framework for the anthroposophical network in Israel. The spread of anthroposophy and the success of its practical offshoots provoked some negative reaction, I guess not surprisingly. Since the 1980s, anthroposophy has been criticized by family members of anthroposophists, by the Orthodox anti-missionary and anti-cult organizations, and by former followers of anthroposophy. The criticism was directed mainly at the Christological elements in anthroposophy, as well as at Steiner's negative attitude toward Judaism and Zionism. The Israeli ultra-Orthodox anti-missionary and anti-cult group, Yad Le'achim, a hand to the brothers, included anthroposophy in its list of cults. In 1987, its supporters in the Israeli parliament, and it has supporters in the ultra-Orthodox parties, called the state and this Jewish agency to stop their support of kibbutz Harduf. Following the growing number of Waldorf kindergartens and schools in the 2000s, Yad L'Achim renewed its activities against the Israeli Anthroposophists and issued a pamphlet entitled The True Face of Anthroposophy. The pamphlet described Anthroposophy as a religious mystical cult that is based on Far Eastern beliefs tainted with Christian and even anti-Semitic characteristics. It claimed that there is not the slightest doubt that the founder of the sect, Rudolf Steiner, was an anti-Semite. In his view, the people of Israel and Jewish culture as a whole represent negative and outdated forces, and there is no justification for their continued existence. The pamphlet cited various sources from Steiner's writing as proof. Criticism against the Christological elements of anthroposophy were voiced also by the Israeli writer and intellectual Yariv ben Aharon. And if the name sounds familiar, yes, it's the same family. He's again another son of the mythical Yitzhak ben Aharon and the elder brother of the spiritual leader of Harduf, Yeshayahu ben Aharon. In 1991, Yariv ben Aharon claimed in a widely circulated interview, which was titled in the newspaper, Koshering Christology, or that they're making Christology kosher, something like that. So he claimed that Anthroposophy demands of its Jewish followers a complete conversion to a Christian paradigm and accused his brother and his friends of concealing the true significance of their teachings. To make the drama even more interesting, Yariv ben Aharon's son, Yiftach ben Aharon, became an anthroposophist, lives in kibbutz Artuf, and supported very much his uncle. I think a theater piece should be written about that story. In recent years, Yisrael Koren, which probably some of you met or know about, a former member of the Anthroposophical Circle in Tivon and a scholar of Jewish studies, has criticized Steiner's attitude toward Judaism and Zionism, first in newspaper articles and later in a 2-volume monograph, Judaism and Anthroposophy, Ancient Controversies in a Modern Garb, published in 2019, and I think he's preparing an English translation of the book. Koren, who first became aware of Steiner's negative views on Judaism through the pamphlet of Yad L'Achim, himself writes it in the introduction to the book, denounced the Israeli anthroposophists for misinforming the public about the racist and anti-Jewish views of Steiner and for concealing the true Christian nature of anthroposophy. Some Israeli anthroposophists responded to this allegation and defended anthroposophy. In response to Yariv ben Aharon allegations, Kibbutz Harduf issued a statement asserting that Steiner's spiritual science is a method of spiritual research unrelated to religion. And I think the declaration is interesting and will open the way for the next stage of the lecture. It declared that Harduf is a Jewish and Israeli creation, deeply rooted in the tradition of our people and in the national, social, and human missions of the State of Israel and the kibbutz movement. Following Koren's criticism, Israeli anthroposophists engaged in discussions concerning the relationship between Judaism and anthroposophy, particularly in the pages of the journal Adam Olam, and later we'll come back to that. So, in the final part of my lecture, I would like to briefly discuss the attempts of the Israeli anthroposophists to reconcile their Jewish identity and commitment to the State of Israel with their anthroposophical convictions. Some of the first Jewish anthroposophists who emigrated to Palestine following the Nazi takeover of Germany and Austria adhered to Steiner's Christology and accepted his views that Judaism has fulfilled its historical role. Rosa Dukas, who emigrated from Germany in 1933 and was active in the Jerusalem Anthroposophical Circle, asserted that life in Israel helped her to overcome the Judaism in herself and reach Christ through Steiner's teaching. Paya Keren, and maybe from this you will understand more my mother's objection to her grandmother, observed that life in Israel was Christian in a true sense. However, following a saying she attributed to Steiner, she asserted that the mission of Israeli Jewish anthroposophists was to spiritualize Christianity. Life in Israel is Christian in the true sense, even if the name of Christ is not mentioned. One hears in many cases that pious Jews experience the etheric Christ and who know whom they are experiencing. When Rudolf Steiner was asked whether the Jews still had a mission, he replied, "They have the mission to spiritualize Christianity. This is an enormous task, and we are working on it with all our might, and we are working with all our might to achieve this goal." Other members of the Anthroposophical network attempted to reconcile their anthroposophical convictions with their adherence to Judaism by calling for an anthroposophical revival of Judaism. Nachman Bar Shalom, the first Israeli-born anthroposophist, asserted in his introduction to the Hebrew translation of How to Know Higher Worlds that anthroposophy is necessary for the revival of Judaism past glory. Why should we not strive to regain our place as in the days of old? How can we achieve this? We must do so by studying the doctrine of spiritual science in all its details, by continuing the translation of the remaining anthroposophical books, and through the esoteric practice of those who reach a certain stage in ethical, rational development that enables them to do so. The relations between anthroposophy and Judaism were also discussed by the younger generation of Israeli-born Hebrew-speaking anthroposophists who aspired to integrate anthroposophy within modern Israeli culture and to reconcile Steiner's spiritual science with secular socialist Zionist ideology. Yeshayahu ben Aaron lectured and wrote extensively about his anthroposophical-inspired vision of the future of Judaism, Israel, and the kibbutz movement. In his introduction to a collection of his lectures and essays entitled The Spiritual Life and the Social Challenge, Ben Aaron asserted that anthroposophy could provide the driving and creative force which is necessary for the revival of Judaism and the development of the kibbutz movement. With the aid of anthroposophy, the entire Jewish tradition can be understood in a deeper, richer, and more productive light. Neither academic research, for all its value and merit, nor orthodox practice could ever supply the living Judaism developing in Israel with the stimulating, vitalizing, and productive power of anthroposophy. Social and communal creation has been the essence of the Jewish spirit throughout all generations, including our own. The kibbutz movement emerged from this essence, but it now urgently needs to be revitalized by the fresh, spiritual, and creative source of our time. Questions relating to the connection between Judaism, Israeli national identity, and anthroposophy emerged also in the framework of Waldorf education in Israel. Gilad Goldschmidt and Michal Ben Shalom, the founders of the first Waldorf school in Harduf, asserted in a book on Waldorf education in Israel. There is a big difference between the Waldorf schools in Harduf, the Waldorf school in Harduf, to other Waldorf schools in the world. The same educational perspective that puts an emphasis on the development of the child and regards him as a whole, varied and multifaceted entity, receives its trajectory and form in Harduf according to the Jewish tradition and the culture of the land of Israel. The Jewish and Israeli trajectory and form of Waldorf education Israel are expressed according to Goldschmidt and Ben Shalom in the celebration of the Jewish holidays, the study of stories of the Old Testament, and the connection to the geography, climate, vegetation, and wildlife of the land of Israel. Another interesting issue that highlights the adaptation of anthroposophy to Israeli ethos is the attitudes to Israeli anthroposophies to their military service, which is compulsory in Israel. An article published in Adam Olam in 2015, and hey, yes, okay, yeah. Observes, and later it was published in German, I said that, observed that at least 12 Israeli anthroposophists, most of them living in Harduf, are veterans of Unit 269, in Hebrew, Sayeret Matkal, the most prestigious Israeli commando unit. The article raises the questions. Is there a karmatic connection between these two small frameworks, the commando unit and Harduf, that leads certain types from one to the other? Is the unique character of the service in the commando unit, the physical and social profile of its conscripts, and its extreme training related somehow to Steiner's spiritual science? Can the unexpected recruitment of the veterans of the secretive commando unit of the Israeli Defense Force to the ranks of anthroposophy teach something about the nature of Sayeret Matkal or about the nature of anthroposophy? The article brings the answers of 4 Israeli anthroposophists who served in the elite unit to these questions. The interviews uniformly describe deep affinities between their commando service and anthroposophy. They interpret the unit's extreme physical and psychological demands as a form of spiritual initiation and view its hierarchical, elitist, and secretive structure as analogous to the Anthroposophical Society and to ancient mystery or chivalric orders. The interviews highlight the successful integration of anthroposophy into Israeli society and culture. Israeli anthroposophists view their prestigious army service as compatible with their anthroposophical convictions. They accept the high value placed on the army and its elite units in Israeli society, yet reinterpret the Israeli ethos through their anthroposophical beliefs. Finally, I would like to mention that the journal Adam Olam published 2 special issues dedicated to anthroposophy, Judaism, and Israeli identity, the first in 2015 and the second in 2020. The volumes include translation of Steiner's controversial article on Zionism, as well as articles by several Israeli anthroposophists and former anthroposophists who present different perspectives on the relation between anthroposophy, Judaism, and Israeli culture. It includes also articles on Waldorf education-inspired Jewish Orthodox education movement that I mentioned, the Ma'ayanot Barchia, interviews with Israel Koren, the former Israeli anthroposophist who criticized China's attitude to Judaism and Zionism, and more. The editor of the 2015 volume, Yonatan Levy, the son of Shimon Levy and the grandson of Eva Levy, one of the founders of anthroposophy in Israel, wrote in the editorial entitled Anthroposophy and Judaism, Can the Two Walk Together? What does it mean to be a Jewish anthroposophist? How does one who feels connected to anthroposophy relates to this fact of faith, to be born to a people with a unique history, relentless, full of suffering, and of inner and external conflicts. How does a Jewish anthroposophist relate to his race, religion, and nation when he feels that Steiner was not able to understand, or maybe that he did understand the essence of Judaism? To conclude, I have presented the history of anthroposophy in the land of Israel from the early 20th century to the present day. This history begins with the activities of Bergman and May Richter and continues with the arrival of the German Jewish anthroposophists following Hitler's rise to power, the establishment of the first anthroposophical circles, and later the founding of the Elijah branch and Bet Eliyahu. Anthroposophy became much more influential in Israeli society in the final decades of the 20th century, following its adoption by a new generation of young Israelis, which led to the founding of Kfar Rafael, Kibbutz Arduf, Waldorf schools, and other anthroposophical initiatives. Despite some opposition, anthroposophy has become the most successful non-Jewish new spiritual movement in Israel, and Waldorf education the most popular alternative educational framework. I opened this lecture by asking how we might explain the surprising success of anthroposophy in Israel, despite Steiner's Christological teachings and critical views of Judaism and Zionism. There is no single or simple answer. Different elements of Steiner's spiritual science, along with various anthroposophical initiatives, were taken by Israelis at different historical moments, responding to shifting ideological, education, and social needs. The reception and spread of anthroposophy in Israel emerged from a complex constellation of contingent factors. This includes the high prestige and cultural capital of the early German-speaking anthroposophists, as well as the social capital and political connections of the young Israeli anthroposophists in the 1980s. The crisis of the socialist secular ethos in Israel, together with the decline of the kibbutz movement in the late 20th century, the introduction of New Age culture and the search for alternative spiritual paths, and the growing parental dissatisfaction with the Israeli education system all contributed to the successful reception of anthroposophy in Israel. Jewish Israeli anthroposophists have addressed and reinterpreted Steiner's Christological teachings and his views on Judaism and Zionism in diverse ways. Some accepted or simply overlooked these aspects, while others developed innovative Jewish Israeli adaptations of anthroposophy. Their engagements offer a compelling case study of how anthroposophy has been received and reshaped within a non-Christian culture. It also provides a useful perspective from which to assess Steiner's teachings and the later developments of anthroposophy, as well as to gain insights into the shifting dynamics of Israeli society and culture. Thank you.
Sponsored by the Program for the Evolution of Spirituality.
Copyright 2023, the President and Fellows of Harvard College.